If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1: The World Before Rome, Italy's Seven Hills and the Age of Legends. Part 1: The Land the Gods Chose, Pre-Roman Settlements on the Palatine Hill, 10th to 9th century BCE. Long before anyone carved a name into stone or sang songs about mighty kings, people were already living on the hills above the Tiber River. These were not builders of palaces or commanders of armies. They were simple herders and farmers, Latin and Sabine people who followed their animals across the landscape and built their homes wherever the land made sense. And the land here made a great deal of sense. Archaeologists have dug carefully into the ground of the Palatine Hill and pulled out the quiet proof of these early lives. Burnt remains of wooden posts that once held up small round huts, pottery broken and buried for centuries, pits dug into the earth to hold the dead. The evidence points clearly to people living here as far back as the 10th century BCE, roughly 3,000 years ago, long before anyone dreamed of an empire or even a city. What they built was nothing grand. Picture small clusters of thatched roof huts sitting on raised ground, surrounded by thick forest and boggy marshland. These people had no marble columns, no public squares, no written laws. What they had was a sharp eye for survival, and the place they had chosen to live was quietly remarkable. 7 hills rose above the flat marshy ground like natural fortresses. The Tiber River curved around them, wide enough to trade along, shallow enough in spots to cross. The soil nearby was dark and fertile, good for growing food. Not far away, salt flats provided one of the most precious resources of the ancient world: salt, which preserved meat and was worth its weight in serious trade. This combination of hills for defense, water for movement, soil for food, and salt for wealth made this stretch of central Italy one of the most naturally gifted pieces of land in the entire Mediterranean world. These early settlers did not know any of this in grand terms. They were not strategists reading maps. They were people following their animals, reading the land the way their fathers had taught them, choosing high ground because high ground kept you alive. Yet in doing so, they placed themselves on the exact spot where centuries later one of the greatest powers the world has ever seen would take its first breath. No legend had named this place yet. No god had claimed it in any story these people knew. But the ground itself was already working quietly in history's favor, gathering people, holding them, feeding them, waiting. The story of Rome does not begin with a king or a wolf or a pair of famous brothers. It begins here, in the quiet before the legend, with ordinary people making ordinary choices on a hill that turned out to be anything but ordinary. Part 2: The Shadow of Troy, how the Trojan War myth traveled to Italy and planted the seed of Roman identity. While those early settlers on the Palatine Hill had no grand story to tell about themselves, someone else did. Across the sea, in the Greek world, poets were singing about a war so devastating it shook the heavens. And without anyone planning it, that story would one day become Rome's story too. Around 1200 BCE, the Greeks told of a great city called Troy, burned to the ground after a decade of brutal war. The poets sang of its heroes, its gods, its tragedy. But tucked inside those famous tales was one figure who did not die in the flames, a Trojan prince named Aeneas. His mother was the goddess Aphrodite herself, which already made him special. When Troy fell and the fire swallowed everything, Aeneas did something remarkable. He did not run empty-handed. He lifted his elderly father Anchises onto his back, took his young son by the hand, and walked out through the smoke and chaos. The gods, the story said, had other plans for him. What followed were years of wandering, storms, false starts, divine anger and divine favor taking turns steering his fate. He lost people. He buried his father on foreign soil. He was briefly tempted to stay in Carthage, where a powerful queen named Dido loved him deeply, but the gods pulled him away. He was not meant to stop. He was meant to reach the western shore of a land the Greeks barely knew, a place called Latium. And eventually, exhausted and tested, that is exactly where he arrived. Now here's the part that matters most. The Romans did not live during the Trojan War. By the time Rome became powerful, Troy had been dust for centuries. So why did they claim this story as their own? Because they chose to. The Romans were smart enough to understand that a great civilization needs a great beginning. Tracing your blood back to a goddess and a legendary hero was not just flattering, it was a political statement. It told the world that Rome was not some rough Latin village that got lucky. Rome was the rightful heir of the greatest story ever told. This was not something the Romans invented out of thin air. Greek writers had already placed Aeneas in Italy in their own poems. The Romans simply picked up that thread and pulled it as far as it would go, eventually weaving it into their law, their religion, and their national pride. That is the quiet power of a myth. It does not need to be true to be real in the way that counts. The Aeneas story gave Rome something the huts on the Palatine hill never could: a soul, a reason to believe they mattered. And from that belief, something extraordinary was about to grow, starting with a small kingdom in the hills just south of where Rome would one day stand. Part 3. Alba Longa and the House of Numitor, the kingdom that would betray its own blood. That small kingdom in the hills, Alba Longa, was no accident of history. It grew directly from the story of Aeneas, built by his descendants across generations, until it became the most important Latin city in the region. Sitting comfortably in the Alban hills, it looked down over the surrounding lands with quiet authority. Other Latin communities answered to it. Priests worshipped Jupiter and Vesta within its walls. It was orderly, respected, and sacred. And by the 8th century BCE, a man named Numitor sat on its throne, a king who had earned his seat through the oldest and most legitimate reason possible. He was born to it, blood of the bloodline that traced itself all the way back to Troy. Numitor was, by every account the myths give us, a fair man. He did not claw his way to power or step over bodies to sit on that throne. It simply belonged to him, the way the sun belongs to the morning. But legitimacy, as history keeps proving, means very little to a man who wants what you have and has the stomach to take it. That man was Amulius, Numitor's own brother. There is something particularly cold about ambition within a family. A stranger who wants your throne is an enemy. A brother who wants it is a wound. Amulius watched Numitor rule, watched the kingdom thrive, watched the treasury fill, and the longer he watched, the more unbearable it became. He was not a man who waited patiently for fate to be kind to him. He was a man who decided to make his own fate, no matter the cost. What is worth noticing here is how close this all sits to where Rome would one day rise. The city that would conquer the world had not yet been born, but the people and the grudges and the desperate decisions that would make its birth possible were already falling into place. A just king sat on a throne he deserved. A jealous brother stood in the shadows, counting what was not his. And somewhere between those two men, the future of an entire civilization was quietly being decided. The surface of Alba Longa looked peaceful. Its temples were tended, its laws were followed, its people went about their lives beneath the Italian sky. But underneath that calm, something was shifting. A man with enough want and enough nerve was about to move. And when Amulius finally acted, he would do so with a coldness that would shock even those who thought they knew him. The betrayal was coming. Part 4. The Usurper's Throne. Amulius seizes power and silences the bloodline. C. 800 to 754 BCE. When Amulius moved, he moved fast. There was no long argument, no drawn-out political struggle. One day, Numitor was king. The next, he was not. His brother had simply decided the throne belonged to him, and that was that. But removing a king was only half the problem. The real danger was what came after. Numitor had sons, young men who carried his blood and his right to rule. As long as they lived, they were a threat. Someone could rally behind them. Someone could use them to take back what Amulius had stolen. So Amulius had them killed. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. The heirs were gone, and with them went any obvious path back to Numitor's rule. That left one loose thread, Rhea Silvia, Numitor's daughter. Amulius could not kill her without creating a scandal that might turn the people against him. Murdering men who could raise armies was one thing. Killing a young woman in cold blood was another. So he did something far cleverer. He had her made a Vestal virgin. The Vestals were priestesses devoted to the goddess Vesta, the sacred flame, and the heart of Roman religious life. Their duty was holy, their status respected, and their vow of celibacy was absolute. A Vestal who broke that vow and bore a child was not simply disgraced. She was executed, buried alive. That was the law, and it had never been broken. Amulius had not raised a hand against Rhea Silvia. He had simply placed her inside a cage made of religion and custom. She could live out her days in peace, honored and untouchable, and completely unable to produce an heir. It was, in its own twisted way, a masterpiece of cruelty. He had erased a bloodline without technically spilling it. He settled into his stolen throne and felt safe. Numitor was old and broken. The sons were dead. The daughter was locked away by sacred duty. The dynasty was finished. What Amulius forgot, or perhaps never truly believed, was that the gods were real. Or at least the Romans believed they were real, which for the purposes of this story amounts to the same thing. Rhea Silvia was a woman set apart from ordinary life, consecrated and surrounded by the sacred. And Mars, the god of war, restless and powerful, did not recognize human political arrangements as limits on his behavior. He never had. The very trap Amulius had so carefully constructed around Rhea Silvia was about to become the door through which everything changed. Chapter 2. Born of War, Suckled by the Wild. The Twins Who Should Have Died. Part 1. The Gods' Intrusion. Mars, Rhea Silvia, and the Forbidden Birth. Then came the part of the story that would make Romans stop and lower their voices whenever they told it. Rhea Silvia was a Vestal virgin, one of the most sacred women in the ancient world. Her job, her entire purpose, was to keep a sacred flame burning and to remain untouched, pure, devoted to the goddess Vesta. Breaking that vow was not just a personal sin. It was considered an offense against the gods themselves, a crack in the spiritual foundation of the whole kingdom. And yet, she was pregnant. Roman tradition did not hesitate for even a moment about who was responsible. Mars, the god of war, had come to her. Whether you believe that literally, or whether you think it was a story invented to explain something deeply inconvenient, or whether some ritual or event lay buried beneath the legend, the result was the same. A Vestal virgin was carrying children. 2 of them. When twin sons were born, the news reached Amulius fast. He was already a man who had stolen a throne and spent years looking over his shoulder for trouble. Now the trouble had arrived in the form of 2 newborn babies, sons of his enslaved niece, sons who, if the story of Mars was believed, carried divine blood in their veins. Any one of those facts would have shaken him. All 3 together terrified him. He made 2 decisions quickly. Rhea Silvia was thrown into prison, which some versions of the story say eventually meant her death, and the twins were to be drowned in the Tiber River. It was a clean, practical solution. No bodies left behind, no graves to visit, no boys growing up to ask difficult questions about who their grandfather really was. The servants were given the order and sent to carry it out. 2 grown men, walking toward a river, holding 2 babies in a basket, with instructions that were about as clear as instructions can be. What happened next changed everything. Not because of gods, not because of miracles, at least not yet, but because of something far more ordinary and far more powerful. The men could not do it. They stood at the edge of that river with 2 infants looking up at them, and they could not throw them in. It is worth pausing on that moment. The entire future of Rome, the Republic, the Empire, the laws, the roads, the language that would shape half the world, balanced on the conscience of 2 unnamed servants who were simply unable to drown 2 babies. Instead, they placed Romulus and Remus in a reed basket and set it on the water. They had technically followed the king's command. Part 2. The basket on the river. How the Tiber's flood became an act of providence. The river did not swallow them, it carried them. The Tiber that day was running high and fast, swollen by seasonal floods that had pushed it well beyond its usual banks. The basket the servants placed on the water did not sink into the deep current. Instead, it drifted, bobbed, and floated downstream with the kind of stubborn steadiness that the Romans would later describe as the hand of the gods at work. And when the water finally pulled back and the basket came to rest, it had stopped at the base of the Palatine hill, right at the mouth of a cave the Romans knew well. They called it a Lupercal. This was not just any cave. Long before Rome existed, the Lupercal was already a place people treated as sacred. It was connected to Lupercus, a god of the wild and of shepherds, a god who belonged to the rough world that existed before cities and laws and walls. It was the kind of place where the boundary between the human world and something older and stranger felt thin. And this is exactly where the two babies landed. Think about what the Romans made of this. A king had ordered 2 infants destroyed. 2 servants had carried out the order halfway and left the rest to the river. And the river, instead of taking the children out to sea or dashing them against rocks, had set them down gently at the most symbolically loaded spot in the entire landscape. That is not the kind of coincidence people in the ancient world let pass without meaning. To Roman eyes, the Tiber had made a choice. The flood had acted like a parent. What is remarkable is how this moment built the entire identity of Rome before Rome existed. The city that would one day conquer the known world began as a basket on a flooded river, resting at the foot of a wild hill. There were no walls yet, no senate, no legions. Just 2 infants, a cave, and a river that had decided for reasons no one could fully explain to deliver them exactly where they needed to be. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. The same river that was supposed to erase Romulus and Remus from history had instead written their beginning. Amulius thought the water would be his weapon. Instead, it became their protector. And now, on the muddy bank, beside a cave that smelled of earth and animal, the 2 smallest people in the story were about to meet someone far stranger than a king or a god. Something was moving toward them in the shadows of the Lupercal. Something wild. Something that should, by every natural instinct, have seemed 2 helpless infants as nothing more than prey. Part 3. The she-wolf and the shepherd. Raised between the wild and the human, it came out of the dark slowly, and it did not attack. The she-wolf that found the 2 crying babies near the Lupercal cave did something no one would have expected. She did not eat them. She lay down beside them, and she let them feed. A woodpecker, the same bird the Romans would later call sacred to Mars, also appeared, dropping scraps of food near the helpless pair. 2 animals, wild and free, choosing to keep 2 small humans alive. To the Romans, this was not a coincidence. This was a message from their gods. When the shepherd Faustulus came across this strange scene, he stood still for a moment, watching a wolf nurse 2 human infants like they were her own. He had heard rumors, vague, dangerous whispers about a Vestal virgin, twin boys, and a king who wanted them dead. Looking at these 2 children, something told him to act. He picked them up carefully, carried them home, and handed them to his wife, Acca Laurentia. Without much question, she took them in and raised them alongside her own children on the rough slopes of the Palatine hill. Life there was not soft. The people Romulus and Remus grew up among were herdsmen, laborers, and tough men who settled arguments with their hands. There were no palace halls or royal lessons, no tutors teaching them how kings were supposed to speak or sit. What they got instead was the kind of education that only hard living provides. They learned how to handle animals, read terrain, move through forests, and survive on very little. They learned how rough men thought, what made them follow someone, and what made them fight. But they were also, without knowing it, something more. There was a quality in both of them that the other shepherd boys did not have. A natural authority, a physical confidence. People looked to them when things got difficult, not because anyone told them to, but because it felt right. They were not merely raised among wolves. In every way that counted, they had become them. This is what made them so dangerous. Romulus and Remus were not kings waiting in comfort for their destiny. They were men forged by wildness, who also happened to carry divine blood. They understood palaces and they understood pastures. They could speak to gods and fight with shepherds. And that combination, royal origin mixed with common grit, would become the very spirit of the city they were about to build. Amulius had ordered 2 infants thrown into a river. What he had actually done was set in motion the creation of his own destruction. The boys were growing up, getting stronger, and the day was coming when they would want answers about who they really were. Part 4. The Young Rebels. Romulus and Remus challenged the king of Alba Longa. They had grown up rough. No palace, no tutors, no fine clothes, just hills, animals, and the constant low hum of danger. But Romulus and Remus were not ordinary shepherd's boys, and somehow everyone around them could feel it. There was something in the way they carried themselves, the way other young men naturally fell in behind them. By the time they reached adulthood, the twins had become the undisputed leaders of the herdsmen scattered across the Palatine hill and the surrounding countryside. Their days were filled with the kind of work that built hard men. They organized raids on neighboring groups, settled arguments with their fists, and protected their people with the cold confidence of those who have never known fear. They were popular because they were useful, and they were dangerous because they were smart. But none of that explained who they truly were. That secret was still buried, waiting. It was a border fight that cracked everything open. During one such clash with a rival group, Remus was captured and dragged before King Amulius, the same king who years earlier had ordered 2 babies drowned in the Tiber. Amulius, not knowing who stood before him, handed Remus off to Numitor, the deposed old king, to deal with as he saw fit. What happened next changed everything. Numitor looked at the young man in front of him. He studied the face, the build, the sheer presence of him, and something stirred. He had lost a daughter. He had been told his grandsons were dead. But the man standing before him looked like family. He asked questions. Remus answered. Piece by piece, the truth assembled itself in the old man's mind, like bones forming a skeleton. This was his blood. This was his grandson. Word reached Romulus quickly. The brothers, now knowing exactly who they were, grandsons of a king, sons of a Vestal virgin and a god, did not sit down and weep or celebrate. They acted. Within what feels in the old stories like almost no time at all, they gathered their followers, armed them, and marched on the palace of Alba Longa. There was no long negotiation, no formal challenge. They stormed in, found Amulius, and killed him. It was clean, fast, and ruthless. Numitor was placed back on his throne. Order, as they saw it, was restored. Justice, as they understood it, had been done. But look closely at what had just happened. 2 young men with a loyal mob had walked into a kingdom and ended a reign with violence. They had not been given power, they had taken it, and in doing so, they revealed something essential about who they were and what kind of city they would one day build. Rome had not even been founded yet, and already its creators had shown that when they wanted something, they would bleed for it. Numitor sat on his throne, older and restored, were already looking at the horizon, thinking about what came next for them. Part 5. The question that cannot have 2 answers. Where to build, and who shall lead. Their grandfather was back on his throne. The wrong had been corrected. Any other men might have stopped there, settled down, and lived comfortably in Alba Longa, as princes of an established kingdom. But Romulus and Remus were not built for comfort. They had grown up rough, on open hills, among herdsmen and wolves. A palace in someone else's city was never going to be enough. So they went back to the 7 hills, back to the Palatine, where a river had once deposited them in a basket, where a wolf had once kept them alive. This land knew them. They knew it. And on it, they decided they would build something entirely their own. But here was the problem neither of them wanted to say out loud. A city needs one ruler, not two. One voice, one name, one man at the top. They had shared everything since birth. The same mother, the same river, the same wolf, the same childhood, the same rebellion. But a throne could not be shared, and somewhere beneath the brotherhood, both of them knew it. Romulus wanted to build on the Palatine hill. It made sense to him. It was where they had been found, where the story began, where the ground itself felt sacred. Remus wanted the Aventine, the neighboring hill, equally defensible and equally familiar. Neither argument was wrong. That was exactly the problem. They agreed to let the gods decide. They would each watch the sky for birds, a practice called Augury, where ancient Romans believed the gods communicated through the movement and number of birds in flight. Whoever saw the better omen would win. It sounded fair. It was not going to be fair, because both men wanted to win too badly for any outcome to feel clean. Remus saw 6 vultures first. Then Romulus claimed to have seen 12. Who had truly won? Each brother had supporters shouting for their man. The argument turned bitter. The air between them, already stretched thin by years of rivalry, finally snapped. What happened next has been told many ways. In some versions, Remus jumped over the shallow boundary wall Romulus had begun to dig, a symbolic line marking the edge of his new city, and did it mockingly to make his brother look foolish. Romulus, in a rage, killed him. In other versions, it was a follower of Romulus who struck the fatal blow. Either way, Remus died, and Romulus stood alone on the Palatine hill, the undisputed founder of a city that would one day rule the world. It was a brutal beginning, a city born not from agreement, but from a brother's blood soaking into the dirt. And yet, in a strange way, it was completely consistent with everything that had come before. These were men who had taken power through force, who had grown up in the wild, who had never waited for permission. Rome, from its very first moment, was a place built by men who played to win, and paid whatever price winning required. What Romulus did next, building his walls and filling his city, would shape an empire. But the shadow of that first killing never fully lifted. Chapter 3. The Furrow and the Murder. Rome is born in blood. Part 1. The Augury of the Birds, Omens, Vultures, and the divine verdict on the Palatine hill. Both brothers had agreed to let the gods decide. No more arguing, no more competing claims. They would watch the sky and let nature speak for them. It seemed like a clean, fair solution. It wasn't. Remus climbed the Aventine hill and waited. Romulus climbed the Palatine and did the same. The idea was simple. Whichever brother received the sign from the gods first, or received the greater sign, would win the right to name and build the city. The sign they were watching for was vultures, large birds that Romans believed carried messages from the divine. Remus saw his birds first. 6 vultures circled over the Aventine, dark wings cutting slow patterns across the sky. He was first. Surely that meant something. His supporters cheered. His claim felt solid. Then Romulus saw his birds. 12 vultures over the Palatine, twice the number. His camp erupted too. More birds meant a stronger blessing. Surely that settled it. But it didn't settle anything. It made things worse. Both brothers stood on their hills, both genuinely believing they had won, both surrounded by loyal men who agreed with them completely. Remus pointed to timing. Romulus pointed to quantity. Neither would back down, and neither side could convince the other. What was supposed to be a divine verdict had delivered 2 verdicts at once, one for each brother. This is the part that should make you stop and think. The gods, if they were truly involved, gave the messy possible answer. Was that carelessness, or was it intentional? Some who recorded this story centuries later suggested the ambiguity was a kind of truth in disguise. that the city about to be born was never going to be built through agreement or shared power. Rome was going to be built through force. The gods, in their strange way, may have simply been honest about that. What began as a peaceful ritual had now cracked open into something uglier. The two brothers who had survived wolves and rivers and the ambitions of a corrupt grandfather were now standing on opposite hills, staring at each other across a valley, with no resolution in sight, and supporters on both sides ready to fight. The birds had spoken. Nobody agreed on what they had said. The only thing left was action, and Romulus was not a man who waited. Part 2. The Sacred Plow. Romulus draws the boundary of a city and declares it holy ground. Romulus did not wait for his brother to agree. He did not call another meeting, hold another vote, or look at another bird. He had already made up his mind, and now he was going to make it official, in the most serious way he knew how. He brought out two animals, a white bull and a white cow. White, because that was the color of purity, of the gods, of things that were meant to last. He yoked them together and attached them to a bronze plow. Then slowly and deliberately, he began to walk around the base of the Palatine hill, letting the plow cut a deep furrow into the earth as he went. This was not just farming. This was a ritual, and everyone watching understood exactly what it meant. Every inch of soil that the plow turned over became sacred ground. The line it cut, what the Romans would later call the pomerium, was not merely a border. It was a wall between the world of the city and everything outside it. To cross that line without permission was not just breaking a rule. It was an act against the gods themselves. When he reached the spots where gates would eventually stand, Romulus carefully lifted the plow out of the ground, carried it over the gap, and set it back down on the other side. Even the openings were deliberate. Even the doorways were controlled. When the circle was complete, he stood up straight and gave the city a name. He called it Roma, after himself. Not after the hills, not after the river, not after any god. After Romulus. This was his city, and he wanted everyone to know it, then and forever. Then he said something that must have made the air feel different. He declared that anyone who crossed these walls without his permission would be killed. Not punished, not turned away, killed. It was the first law of Rome, spoken out loud before the city even had a single building inside its boundary. The ground was holy, the line was real, and the penalty for ignoring it was death. Think about what this moment actually was. A man walked in a circle with a plow, and in doing so, created a place that had not existed before. He gave it a name, gave it rules, and gave it a God-backed threat to protect it. It was audacious. It was also deeply serious. Romulus was not playing games or performing for an audience. He believed, and he needed others to believe, that this furrow in the dirt was the beginning of something that could not be undone. And somewhere nearby, his twin brother Remus was watching all of this. Part 3. The leap that started history. Remus mocks the wall and pays with his life. Remus had been watching his brother the whole time, and the longer he watched, the more irritated he became. Think about it from his side. Just days ago, the bird contest had ended in a messy tie that settled nothing. Now Romulus was out here dragging a plow through the dirt, talking about sacred walls and divine laws, naming the city after himself, and declaring that anyone who crossed his little furrow would be killed. Remus had seen 6 vultures first. He had a claim too. And yet here was his twin brother acting like a king who had already won. So Remus did what frustrated, proud men often do. He decided to make a point. He walked up to the shallow furrow Romulus had carved into the ground, the so-called Wall of Rome, and he jumped over it. Just like that. One quick leap. It was not an act of war. It was a joke. A way of saying, look at this ridiculous line in the dirt. Look how easily any real enemy would cross it. Look how silly all of this is. He was mocking the whole performance. It was the worst decision he ever made. What happened next depends on which ancient writer you believe. Some say Romulus himself, shaking with rage, grabbed a weapon and struck his brother down with his own hands. Others say a fight broke out between their followers, and Remus was killed in the chaos. One version gives Romulus a line that became famous: "So perish anyone else who leaps over my walls." Cold, absolute, final. Whatever the exact details, the result was the same. Remus lay dead on the ground, beside the furrow he had jumped over for a laugh. Here is the part that should stop you for a moment. The very first law of Rome, the city that would one day rule most of the known world, was enforced within minutes of being declared. And the first person it killed was the co-founder's own twin. The man who had been raised alongside Romulus, who had survived the same wolf den and the same river, who had fought the same enemies and shared the same impossible origin story. Rome did not begin with a celebration. It began with a killing. That blood soaked into the ground of the Palatine hill before a single building had been raised, before a single citizen had moved in, before the city had done anything at all. And it set a tone that Rome would carry for centuries. The boundary is sacred. The rule is enforced. Sentiment has no place here. Romulus was now alone. He had his hill, his furrow, his name on the city, and a dead brother. What he did not have was people to fill it. Part 4. King of an Empty City. Romulus opens Rome's gates to exiles, criminals, and runaway slaves. So there stood Romulus, king of a hill, ruler of an empty city. He had a name carved into history, a sacred boundary drawn in the earth, and a dead brother behind him. But walls without people are just walls. A city needs bodies, voices, hands. And Romulus had almost none of that. Most rulers of that era would have tried to attract the noble, the wealthy, the well-connected. They would have reached out to powerful families from neighboring lands and offered them status and land. Romulus did the opposite. He threw the gates wide open for everyone nobody else wanted. He declared Rome an asylum, a sanctuary, a place where your past did not follow you in. If you had run away from your master, Rome would take you. If you had committed a crime in another city and needed to vanish, Rome would take you. If you had been stripped of your citizenship, thrown out of your homeland, left with nothing but the clothes on your back, Rome would take you. No questions asked, no record checked. Just come in, plant your feet, and call this place home. The city filled fast, not with poets or merchants or aristocrats, but with the desperate. Men with hard eyes and harder histories. Men who had already lost everything once and were not willing to lose again. Men who owed Romulus their entire second chance at life and would bleed for him because of it. They had no loyalty to any other king, no homeland pulling them back, no comfortable lives waiting if they left. Rome was all they had, so Rome was everything to them. This was not an accident. Romulus understood exactly what he was doing. A man with nothing to lose fights differently than a man with a comfortable farm back home. These rough, rootless people were not a weakness. They were a weapon. But here is where the story gets even more interesting. Romulus now had a city full of men and almost no women. His new citizens could not build families, could not raise children, could not give Rome a future beyond their own lifetimes. The city that had filled so quickly was still, in a very real sense, one generation away from disappearing entirely. Romulus had solved one crisis only to find another one waiting directly behind it. That problem would lead him to one of the most dramatic and controversial moments in all of Roman history. A moment that would involve treachery, violence, and the forced bringing of women from a neighboring people called the Sabines. Rome's founding was far from finished. If anything, it was about to get messier. Chapter 4. Building a City from Nothing. Laws, War, and the Women Who Made Rome Last. Part 1. The Senate and the Tribes. Romulus invents the institutions of Roman power. Romulus had a city, but a city without order is just a crowd. He knew that. So almost immediately after the walls went up and the fires were lit, he got to work building something more important than buildings. He built a system. He started by dividing his people into 3 groups, which he called tribes: the Ramnes, the Tities, and the Luceres. Nobody is entirely sure where these names came from, or even who exactly belonged to each group. But what mattered was that every person in Rome now had a place. Each tribe was then cut into smaller pieces, 30 of them in total, called curiae, and these smaller groups handled the everyday business of being Roman: who paid taxes, who served in the army, who got a vote. Then Romulus did something that would echo for 1,000 years. He picked 100 of the oldest, most respected men in the city and named them his advisors. He called them the Patres, the Fathers. These men became the first Roman Senate. At first, they simply helped the king make decisions. But this small council of elders would slowly, over centuries, grow into the most powerful governing body the ancient world had ever seen. What Romulus also built, whether he meant to or not, was inequality. From the very beginning, there were two kinds of Romans: the patricians, who came from noble or well-connected families, sat above everyone else. And then there were the plebeians, the ordinary people, the masses. They worked, they fought, they paid, but they did not have the same power or the same voice. This gap between the two classes would cause enormous tension for centuries. The common people would push back, demand more rights, stage protests, and sometimes refuse to fight in wars until they were heard. And yet, strangely, this constant back and forth between the powerful and the powerless made Rome stronger. Each time the city was forced to negotiate, to compromise, to include more people in its decisions, its government became more durable. The conflict, rather than tearing Rome apart, stretched it into something bigger and more resilient. Romulus had started with a hill full of runaways and criminals. In what felt like no time at all, he had given them tribes, laws, assemblies, and a senate. He had turned chaos into structure. But one enormous problem remained, and no law or institution could fix it on its own. Rome had men, plenty of them. What it desperately did not have was women. And without women, without families and children, everything Romulus had just built would vanish within a single generation. Part 2. The Rape of the Sabine Women. Rome steals its future to survive the present. Rome had solved the problem of order. It had tribes, laws, a senate, and a clear hierarchy. On paper, it looked like a real city, but there was a crack in the foundation that no law could patch. Look around Rome in those early years and you would notice something unsettling. It was almost entirely men. Runaways, escaped slaves, wandering shepherds, men with troubled pasts. They had come to Romulus's city because they had nowhere else to go. But they had not brought families with them. And without women, without marriages and children, Rome would simply age and die. One generation and it would all be over. Romulus knew this. Every neighboring community knew it too. When Roman men went to nearby villages asking for wives, the answer was always no. Who would give their daughter to a city of outcasts? These neighbors were not being cruel, they were being careful. Rome had a reputation, and not a flattering one. So the doors were closed, politely but firmly, again and again. Romulus decided that if the doors would not open, he would knock them down. He sent invitations across the region, announcing a grand festival in honor of Neptune, the god of the sea. It would be a celebration, games, food, music, a chance for neighboring peoples to come and see this new city with their own eyes. The Sabines, a respectable and well-established Italic people living not far from Rome, accepted the invitation. They came in good faith, entire families traveling together, fathers holding their daughters' hands, curious and unsuspecting. The festival began normally enough. Then Romulus gave the signal. Roman men surged through the crowd and grabbed the unmarried Sabine women. The fathers, brothers, and male relatives were shoved out and chased from the city. In a matter of minutes, Rome had stolen what it could not ask for. Romulus moved quickly to prevent this from becoming simple brutality. He personally spoke to the terrified women, promising them something remarkable: not slavery, but citizenship, legal marriages, property rights, a real place in Roman society. He wanted wives, not prisoners. Whether the women found any comfort in those promises in that moment is hard to say. What is certain is that the world outside Rome was furious. The violation of hospitality, inviting guests to a celebration and then attacking them, was one of the gravest crimes a people could commit in the ancient world. The Sabines especially would not let this go unanswered. They had lost their daughters. They would come back for them, and they would come back with swords. Rome had made enemies, serious, determined enemies, but it had also secured something it could not survive without: a future. The city would not die in a single generation after all. The price of that future, however, was a war that was now coming straight toward them. Part 3. The Sabine War and its astonishing end. When the stolen women throw themselves between armies. That war came fast. Titus Tatius, king of the Sabines, was not the kind of man to grieve quietly. He gathered his warriors and marched straight for Rome, fury driving every step. And he nearly won. The Sabines pushed the Romans back hard. Then came the betrayal that cracked Rome open from the inside. A Roman girl named Tarpeia, reportedly bribed with promises of gold, opened the gates of the Palatine hill, one of Rome's most important strongholds, to the enemy. Just like that, the Sabines were inside. The fighting spilled down into the valley below, the same stretch of ground where Romans would one day build their great forum, the beating heart of their civilization. But on that day, it was just a blood-soaked battlefield with two sides who hated each other. Then something happened that nobody expected. The Sabine women ran onto the battlefield, not with weapons, with babies. These were the same women who had been taken from their families not long before. By now, many of them were wives, many were mothers. And they had just watched the two halves of their lives, their fathers and brothers on one side, their husbands and children on the other, prepare to kill each other. They threw themselves into the middle of it all. They wept, they screamed, they held their infants up and begged both armies to stop. They told the Sabine men that if they killed the Romans, they were killing the fathers of their grandchildren. They told the Romans that if they killed the Sabines, they were killing the grandfathers of their children. There was no winning here, only loss, no matter who struck the next blow. Both armies stopped. Hardened men mid-battle simply stopped. It is one of the most remarkable scenes in all of ancient storytelling, and whether it happened exactly this way or not, the meaning behind it is undeniable. The women understood something the men did not, that they were no longer two separate peoples. They were already one. The fighting was pointless. It was over before anyone admitted it. A peace was made. Titus Tatius and Romulus agreed to rule together. The Sabines did not go home. They stayed. Their people merged with the Romans, doubling the city's strength in a single moment. What began as an act of desperate theft had somehow ended in unity. Rome had stolen women to survive, and those very women had saved the city from destroying itself. It was messy, morally complicated, and entirely human, but it worked. Rome was bigger now, and it was still standing. The question was what it would do next, and what would happen to the man who had built it all from nothing. Part 4. The Disappearance of Romulus. A king ascends to godhood, and Rome is left to find itself. That question, what would happen to the man who built Rome from nothing, was about to be answered in the strangest way imaginable. Romulus ruled for 37 years. That is a long time for any man to hold power, especially one who had built his city by bending every rule he could find. He had waged wars, doubled his population by stealing women, merged with his enemies, and created a government from thin air. By any measure, he had succeeded. Rome was real. Rome was growing. Rome was not going away. And then, one day, Romulus was simply gone. The official story was remarkable. During a violent storm, some accounts say a solar eclipse that turned the sky dark in the middle of the day, Romulus disappeared from sight. When the light returned, he was nowhere to be found. The explanation offered to the Roman people was that his father, the god Mars, had reached down from the heavens and taken him back. Romulus had not died. He had become a god himself, given the divine name Quirinus, and Rome would build him a temple and worship him as one of their own immortals. It was a magnificent story. It was also extremely convenient, because another version of events survived in quieter corners of Roman memory, and it told a very different tale. In this version, the senators, the very men Romulus had appointed to advise him, had grown tired of him. 37 years of one man making all the final decisions will do that to a governing body. The story whispered that during a senatorial meeting, the senators turned on Romulus, killed him, and then smuggled the pieces of his body out of the room hidden beneath their robes. No body, no crime, just a king who had, conveniently, ascended to godhood. Neither story could be proven. Both were useful. A city that believed its founder had become a god felt chosen, protected, special. A senate that had quietly disposed of a king who had grown too powerful had sent a message that no single man, not even the founder himself, was above the institution. Both ideas would shape Rome for centuries. But here is what is truly remarkable about this moment. Rome did not collapse when Romulus vanished. The Senate kept meeting, the tribes kept functioning, the army kept training, the laws kept holding, the city kept breathing. Romulus had built something that did not need him anymore, and that was perhaps his greatest achievement of all, greater than any battle won or wall built. A city that could outlast its founder was a city that could outlast almost anything, and Rome was just getting started. Part 5. The Seed Becomes a Story. How 753 BCE turned a small Latin village into the origin of Western civilization. And then, almost quietly, the story became bigger than anyone in it. Rome did not wake up one morning and decide to become the foundation of Western civilization. It happened piece by piece, generation by generation, through small decisions and brutal fights and desperate compromises. After Romulus vanished, the city kept doing what it had always done, absorbing, adapting, and surviving. The Sabines, once enemies, became Romans. The Etruscans, powerful neighbors to the north, were held back. Kings came and went, each one chosen and given power by the people and the Senate, rather than simply born into it. That idea alone, that a leader could be selected, not just inherited, was something genuinely new in the ancient world. What made Rome different from every other small village on every other Italian hillside was not its location or its resources. It was the story it told about itself. The she-wolf nursing 2 abandoned boys, the basket floating down the Tiber, the sacred furrow drawn in the dirt to mark where a city would one day stand. The brother killed so that the walls would mean something. These were not just old tales people repeated around fires. They were a kind of instruction manual. They told every Roman, in every generation, exactly who they were supposed to be. Chosen, tough, willing to pay any price, and open enough to take in strangers without losing their identity. That last part mattered enormously. Rome's founding story was, at its heart, a story about becoming. Romulus himself was an outsider who built a home for other outsiders. The Sabine women became Roman mothers. Former enemies became citizens. The city had a talent, almost from birth, for turning rivals into Romans, and that talent would eventually stretch across continents. By 509 BCE, when the Romans finally threw out their last king and declared themselves a republic, the founding myths were already old and sacred. Children grew up hearing them. Soldiers marched into battle carrying them. Politicians invoked them in arguments about law and power. The stories of 753 BCE were not history to these people. They were identity. They were the reason Rome deserved to exist, deserved to win, deserved to lead. And lead it would. The small refuge of outcasts on 7 hills would grow into something that shaped the language you speak, the laws your country follows, the buildings your architects still copy, and the very idea that a republic, a government of the people, is worth fighting for. It all traces back to that muddy hilltop, that disputed birth date, that contested founding. Whatever really happened in 753 BCE, something began there that the world has never quite finished with.